Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Stefan, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thank you very much.
For people that are unfamiliar, I mean, we actually got our first introduction through Shan Rafael, who, like I was just saying, we put his episode out today. Incredible individual, and really, really privileged to be able to get this connection. So for people that are unfamiliar, I'm going to bore you with your own qualifications for a second, and I'm sure I'll get a million of them wrong anyway. But so you hold a master's with a dissertation in solving tactical problems using control engineering, systems identification and modeling, and you then went on to become a doctor in philosophy at the Department for Fire Safety Science at Lund University, majoring in the area of command and control of firefighting operations, with your minor being firefighting procedures. That is a hell of a mouthful, and I'm sure that only a very small aspect of sort of the adventures that you've taken. I sort of actually wanted to start in a random place, which is like, how do you know Shan? How did you guys sort of meet each other?
Oh, actually a funny story in a sense, because I was in 2007. I was, for some reason I don't really understand yet, but I'm still very grateful for it. I was invited to by the New Zealand Fire Service,
okay,
to come over for a couple of weeks, and to travel around and see their countryside and how they do the operations. And that was a conference where I did some presentations, and I went to do some presentation at least a couple of fire stations as well. A lot of fun. And just a couple of days before coming down to New Zealand, and this is actually amazing, because the shortest way to New Zealand from Sweden is actually literally straight down. So
okay.
You have these two countries on opposite sides of the globe.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents, and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
And one night I was standing in a fire station, and I was just about to start my presentation. It's a volunteer fire station.
Okay.
So I was just about to start my presentation, just talking about the Swedish Fire Service a little bit. And they had this call, and it was like 10 seconds, and the room was empty.
Really?
And I was standing there. It's like, what happened? And 20 minutes later, they came back. It was false alarm, and I did my presentation, and afterwards we just had a couple of beers. We talked about stuff, and I realized at that point that it's you have these countries as far apart as you can come. It's on the other side of the globe from my point of view.
Yeah.
But we do the same stuff. We have similar equipment. We have the same thoughts. We have the same jokes at the fire stations. Different brands of beer, but that's another story. And I mean, and I've been traveling ever since in a few places as well, and I realized that wherever you are internationally, we have this common thing about putting fires out and saving people and car accidents and whatever. And it's at that point, at that fire station, I realized it was like I don't know, it was a moment.
Yeah, 100%.
Just amazing to realize that we have this international fire service community doing stuff differently, but at the same time in a very, very similar way.
Mm. That's
Same
something that really
jokes,
fascinates me.
same thoughts. Yeah, yeah,
The more I've done the podcast, the more it opens my eyes. Because initially, when I started doing this, like I had certainly thought about the aspect of it being a niche, and how many people in the Western world would I be able to speak to? I mean, there's a tremendous list, and I'll probably never get through that list. But then, as I even started to pan out even more and look at the global fire and rescue service, that's almost been the most fascinating thing to me because,
yeah, yeah.
like I say, we had somebody on from South Africa the other day, and very similar problems everywhere. But there's something around the social biases, their upbringing, perhaps their economy, perhaps just the way that problem solving happens in those countries, that they have come up to different solutions or different aspects of how to solve these ever-present issues that we seem to have everywhere. We've got the whole animal factory. I feel like I should let my dog in.
Yeah. There's a cat coming up behind me, and I have a dog next to me, my couch here. So sorry. Well, coming back to Chan Rafael, and just a couple of days before coming down to New Zealand, they told me that there's this other guy who's going to join us for a couple of days in the car when we was driving around. I met this guy in the car. He's like, oh, hello, good morning, and whatever. We started to travel, and like 5 minutes into the trip, he started to ask me questions. And I sort of realized that he knew more about my work than I did myself. So I have to dig in my bag and find my computer and put it up and figure, and he had these questions. I had to figure out the answers and everything. I had to look into my literature and everything. It's like, and that was Chan Rafael. And that was also one of those moments where I realized that and I hadn't realized that before, actually, that when I write stuff, I have people all over the world reading that stuff and probably knows more of what I have written than I do myself, because I just read it. I write the stuff. I don't read it. Other people read it. I just write it. So
I've found that when I've had conversations with people, we have people emailing and writing about the podcast about certain guests. And I'm like, damn, I was part of that conversation and it seems to have evaporated out of my mind, which is, but I suppose it's the context again, isn't it? And when you say like those people know more about it than you do, perhaps they've simply had different experiences, like, because you've got a very unique lens, I think, that you look through things. Not only have you gone down the academic route, but you also work as part of the fire and rescue service as well. But I wanted to cast our mind back a little bit, because you actually started back in '86, didn't you? But how did your whole journey in the emergency services begin?
Well, we have this mandatory military service, a year, and I did that as a firefighter in the Air Force for a year.
How old are you when you have to do that? Sorry, how old is mandatory service?
19. 18,
do they still
19.
do that now?
We had this a few years where we didn't have that mandatory military service, but now we're sort of getting back on track again.
I think it's really valuable to do things like that, and I really wish we had it in the Western world, because you pick up so many great character traits. I mean, what do you think that does for people's development and building that character, having that time in service?
Well, just sort of being sort of forced to live with other people and work with other people and be respectful to other people. It's valuable to anyone. It's a great.
It also acts like a great calibrator, doesn't it? The impact that you have on those around you when you're sheltered in your own home with your own family, you can be very unaware of the impact that you're having on other people and how to operate in normal society. And then almost when you do enter a real profession, perhaps in your 20s or your 30s, some people are hit with an overwhelming surprise because of why they don't seem to be able to integrate or cooperate very well, or even just like adhere to certain systems or rules.
Maybe especially in the military service, because you have people from all over places, from all kinds of trades, and some of these guys didn't go to school, or not for very long at least, and some of us were aiming at going on to university and some didn't. So it was a sort of a mixture of different people with different mindsets and different thoughts. So that was kind of a very good way to learn how other people think and work, and how their view on things in the world.
It's almost like a forced interaction, isn't it? Because you can't just avoid it like you would in normal life. You actually have to
No,
live around it, and
you
also
have to do
work
it.
out how to work as a team in those environments with people
Yeah,
that perhaps don't share similar views to you, which is society in general.
yeah, yeah. No,
So
so
you did
that
that
was
first year, sorry,
yeah,
and
that
then
was a great year. And then I went to university, had my bachelor degree in fire safety engineering, and I went to this. We have this. I think it's known as a two entry level system in the fire service. So you can start as a fireman and work your way up through the ranks.
yes,
But you can also do you can have this bachelor degree in fire safety engineering, and you do 1 year what we call a senior officers course.
mhm. We
And
have that now. It's effectively called direct entry. We're bringing it back in. So if you have a degree in anything, really, it hasn't necessarily got to
okay,
be in something in the fire profession. It just, I think a degree demonstrates that you can assimilate a certain amount of information in a given period of time. So you are
yeah,
perhaps you have the neurological capacity
yeah,
to
yeah,
lead at a certain or plan and organize at a certain level.
yeah. So that system was introduced in 1989, pretty much. I went to the second course that in that system, and we still have it. And I'm these days I'm very much involved in the training of these senior fire officers, young people.
Wow.
I had them all day today. We did a class on well, actually, firefighting, putting fires out, but in model scale.
Do you think they need to know things down at that level? Let's just wander off in this area for a second, because when I speak to people in the UK and they go, I'm very worried about people coming in from outside of the sector and not knowing anything about firefighting. But if you position them correctly, so in a lot of the UK, people will come in at an area manager, which is different terminology across the UK. But some places they come in as a station officer or a station commander, which I think is a little bit close to the action. And what I mean by that is you have the ability at that level to potentially give a direct instruction to somebody that could cause them harm if you don't have a fuller understanding of the dynamics and ever-changing complexity of an incident. So that concerns me a little bit. What's your thoughts there?
I think that, well, these young people I have in my classes these days, they after this year they have the formal rank of a fire chief, but it's not. It may sound weird to someone, but I think it's actually, to answer your question, I think it's very important for any high ranked officer, including a commissioner or fire chief, to have this knowledge about, what do you call that in English? So, well,
different levels, the different ranks, a basic understanding.
Let's say a first level firefighter.
Fundamentals.
Yeah, exactly. They need to know what the work is about, how
they need to know
it.
what it's about, but do they need to be like, and this is the argument I keep going through in my head with other people, is do they need to be acutely aware of all of the potential hazards and stuff like that? Because ultimately, most often they're not going to be right there on the incident ground. And equally, it's a little bit like saying if I was at a certain level in the fire service and I was in charge of IT, fire safety, accounting, whatever, I don't need to know everything about that area. I have a subject matter expert there. So there's two sides to the coin, isn't there?
They are still responsible.
True.
So if they, in order to be responsible and to take that seriously, they need to know how each individual fire, well, not only on an individual level, but they need to know what the work as a fireman is, what it's about, the risks they're taking, how they actually work on the fire scene, how they assess the situation and all that stuff. And I think that is a very important basis for any high-ranked officer. Otherwise, even if you work with the budgets, if you don't understand what the numbers in the Excel sheet is about,
it's open to abuse, isn't it? It's open to you having the wool pulled over your eyes if you don't at least have a fundamental understanding of it. Do you ever have a problem with respect from individuals at the grassroots level, at the firefighter level? Do they not have any pushback against people coming in it? Because this is where, like I say, we're starting to bring it back in, and some people are starting to voice those concerns of, I'm not going to listen to so-and-so. What do they know about firefighting? Which is immature and frustrating at times.
We used to have a discussion like that, but that is like 35 years ago.
Okay.
I mean, if you have these young people, they go through university, 3.5 years. We give them senior officers course 1 year, and then they start to work in the fire service. They have no experience, not really, but give them a few years. Then you have this very interesting and actually great mixture of an academic background, and then they have this experience. It works very well.
You've got a dangerous hybrid there. I say dangerous in a complementary sense. You've got someone with a real, because ultimately, I think on the opposite side of the coin, there's actually something very dangerous about having a knuckle dragging firefighter like me. If I've not had the correct academic development, to have me in charge of a fire and rescue service at this point in my career, if I had accelerated through the ranks, and people in the UK fire and rescue service are accelerating through the ranks at the minute because we're going through so much retirement, there is a danger of having people in positions that actually you're effectively running a multi-million-pound organization then, and you don't really have an understanding of what that involves.
I had the commissioner in Stockholm in my as a student 20 years ago. He's doing great. Makes you sort of proud a little bit. Very much, actually. But
what are just for people that are, and I'll put myself in this group, people that aren't tremendously familiar with the setup of fire and rescue services over there, what's the average sort of size, and what does it look like over there?
Sweden is a very long country.
Okay.
It's like I think it's like 1,800 kilometers something, and we tend to, especially I live in the very south, and we tend to sort of think that, well, Stockholm is like in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
It's like less than a third of the country. So the northern parts of Sweden is it's not very populated. There are people living there, of course, lots of people, but it's a very large part of the country, which means that you have some very interesting issues in the fire service to find people to work in the fire station.
Yeah, but recruitment's challenging there.
Yes, and it's a very long distances between the cities and the fire stations. Down here in the south where I live, in any situation, any call we would get down here, I can have any resources, as much as I like and more, within 20, 25, 30 minutes.
Okay.
And I'm really talking any resources. When up in the northern parts of Sweden, you can have a fire stations in a smaller city with a crew of 5 or 6 or maybe 7. The next crew is like 45 minutes away, an hour and a half away.
Yeah.
So I mean, it creates some very special problems up in the northern parts of Sweden.
I had that when I first joined. I worked in a rural fire station, and again, we would be the furthest from any other station in the service that I worked for at the time, and it really does present a different set of dynamics for like the structure and planning or strategic thought behind an incident commander's decision-making process and what they will have and when in terms of the initial actions when they get to an incident, which I suppose kind of leads me into, because the work you've been doing predominantly for the last 15 years, I mean, we spoke about the instructing aspect there, but this part of your work in experimental and theoretical investigations of firefighting tactics, including methods, I found that, and I thank you for sending over the document. I'm actually going to attempt to take a little passage of it here and just catapult us into a little bit of a discussion in around the documentation, and we'll try and make it. Is it able to be available to people? Are you happy to have it shared? If not, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Okay, so if anybody wants
some of the literature in that list is should be available at least somewhere.
Beautiful. We'll put a link to in the podcast. So the publication itself is around emergency response management in today's complex society, which I think is a lovely little introduction, because the complexity of the type of incidents that we're attending does require some fundamental changes around tactics. And so when it comes to tactics, it says the term tactic is often used in connection with sports and sporting events, which commonly in connection with group activities. We also talk about tactics in connection with, for example, chess, which I think is a beautiful analogy, where the various pieces of a chessboard can only be moved according to certain rules, i.e. certain set patterns, and a situation must be handled according to these rules. Now, the pieces have different tasks in the game, and the players have to use these pieces in the best possible way by making optimal use of their different qualities. These qualities must be applied effectively, partly in use of each piece and partly in terms of the pieces as a unit. This is a beautiful analogy in comparison to the situations that we face in incidents in the emergency services, where different team members have different qualities and properties, i.e. BA equipment, air ladder platforms, rope rescue, whatever the pump operators, all the different aspects, water supplies and all that sort of stuff. So when we're looking at those tactics in terms of a game of chess with the pieces and the rules, you have this lovely thing in there around these 5 essential aspects. They fall around measures, optimization, context, dynamics, and control. Or those 5 essential aspects. Why did you get interested in the work?
I think my interest started already when I did my senior officers course back in 1990, where I started thinking about that there wasn't really, we didn't really have any theory about how firefighting operations, rescue operations work. You can see these patterns, but it's more like a skilled craftsman.
Yes, it's almost like an art form, isn't it? It's very personal.
Exactly.
Everyone has their own different approach to it a little bit. But there should ultimately be some overarching rules or thought processes which we could all adopt.
The fire service is, and it still is, in a sense, this master apprentice. You have this master in the trade, and you have these students, the apprentices, and the master tell the apprentices, this is how you do the work. Depending on which master you have, when the apprentices have questions, you get different answers. And I was thinking about, well, there has to be a better way of sort of figuring out what is the best way of doing a fire operation.
Because ultimately, in terms of instructing and or teaching it as well in your capacity, if we refer to it simply as an art form, or sometimes I've heard it referred to as an instrument, like there's a bunch of instruments. So when a certain incident commander shows up, they will play those instruments in a different way and you'll have a different outcome. Now, it'll all be music and all of it might be safe, but there shouldn't be, and we sort of echo back to this at the beginning of our conversation, when you look across the different tactics across the world to ultimately deal with many of the same problems or incidents, it's interesting to see the different songs that get played, if that makes sense, even when many of the hazards, risks, and associated challenges will probably
I see similar. On many occasions I use the chessboard as to make comparisons and see the similarities, but you can also use an orchestra where you have this conductor, which is the officer, and then you have these different parts in the orchestra. You have the violins up front, and you have the horns in the back, and you have whatever, and then you play a song, and the conductor sort of sets the scene a little bit and makes the what do you call that?
Makes the song, makes
the tempo.
Yeah. The tempo, sorry,
yeah. And he or she sort of points at the different sections in the orchestra, and you have the same thing in an operation, in a fire rescue operation, where you have this officer you have these people grouped. You have the violins here. That's the pumper, and you have the BA crew in the back, and you have this elevated platform over here, and he points them where you want them to be, and you sort of try to use your resources, the orchestra, in the best possible way to make a beautiful song out of it. And you can make comparisons to art as well. If you can, well, let me put it this way. And I do apologize, but I'm not very interested in sports.
That's okay.
I'm not the regular fire service guy.
Neither am I. Don't worry about it.
But when I look at when there's soccer on the television, they play football. I know some of the rules, of course, but most of us can usually tell if the game is played well or not.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if you are cheering for Sweden or for Germany or for Australia or whatever. but you can always, if there's a sort of a flow in the game, and when it looks beautiful, in a sense, it usually works pretty good.
And also, there's so many factors. Like, I love that analogy where you could apply it. So to use that sporting analogy, and again, I will get this totally wrong because I'll get it, but like the formation of the squad, for example, they might do a 4-4-3 or 4, I don't know how many players are involved in it, to be honest with you, but they'll either have that formation, and in certain hands that might seem risky, or against a certain opponent that might seem risky, but it also depends on different factors. So when I echo that onto like an incident command analogy, it would be some people will have a high risk appetite and they will go straight in for what we might refer to as rapid deployment, and they will take things, they will put in place systems of work that may in ways appear slightly riskier, but if you are a more assertive individual, if you've got really strong command presence, if your briefing is really detailed to the point and well understood, you almost shrink the likelihood, or you shrink the opportunity for risk, because you have controlled all of those aspects. But with somebody who perhaps doesn't have that level of assertiveness, or doesn't have that command presence, or doesn't just have, I always think of it like a hug. You want to get to an incident and give it a really big hug as quick as possible. What I mean by that is, if you can't get your fingers all the way around the other side of it, then this incident is bigger than you, and you need to begin sectorizing it, or you need more eyes, ears, observations, and different areas of that incident ground. But most people, through their presence, through their assertiveness, through their control of their team and their briefings, they can give it a big hug very quickly. But people that operate slightly differently, and this is probably something I'd love to ask you around bringing people in who haven't had that. I mean, you said there about spending a year in the military. That will give you a great character calibration about how to speak to people, how to
work with other people.
Yeah, and how to delegate people, how to do those sorts of skill sets. But if you haven't had them, if you've spent all of your life in an academic background, when it comes to a noisy incident ground in the middle of the night, and there's a knuckle dragging firefighter like me who only responds to strong command, then that could really infuriate them if you are not clear, concise, assertive, and then the risk heightens because our level of shared situational awareness starts to fall quite dramatically.
Yeah. I mean, I use these everyday situations when I try to explain and teach in command and control to my students. And there's so many similarities from the orchestra. And I have it with the dog next to me. I'm her handler. She has to trust me, and I have to trust her. You have the same with the crews on the fire station. She needs to
know who's in charge as well.
Exactly.
She's a pack animal. We all are.
Yes. And in the fire stations, my crews need to trust me, and I need to trust them. So you have these similarities. That's going down the leadership thing, but it's very strongly connected to command and control and to tactics as well, because that's sort of where you start. I mean, command and control is a sort of the hard thing, how you organize things. Leadership is about how you work with people, and tactics is, to me, how you sort of what you need to do to get things in the way you need it to be done.
Yeah, if you have a business or an academic mindset, that aspect you speak of there around control and tactics and strategies, people can get that bit. But I've seen people struggle with that aspect of command. And I know we don't necessarily want to venture down the leadership aspect, because that's been done in many capacities and people speak very highly of that. But that command aspect, if people feel like that's not a natural lean for them, that can be difficult. Whereas they can have their tactics and their strategies boxed off in their mind, or they can have them down on a piece of paper, or they know how they want it to look. But if they can't couple that with effective command, delegation, command presence, once again, I'm like a broken record, but that's where it all falls down. What are some of the challenges you find when you're working with students? Is there a particular aspect that they struggle with, or that you feel sometimes requires more consultation or more deliberation for them?
I think one of the big things, I was about to say a problem. It's not really a problem. It's more like a challenge.
Okay.
And that's in many cases because they come from this academic world, and they sometimes tend to think too much. So they try to analyze things to the point where you sort of find this is the best solution.
Mhm.
This is the way to do it. And I try to explain to them from day one. I mean, there's no such thing as the perfect operation.
No.
Well, you might find it afterwards. When you analyze it afterwards, you can probably find the operation. I don't think it's likely, but in theory,
It's always easier to connect the dots looking backwards, isn't it? And also in academia, you are often dealing with fixed, static problems, whereas when you move into the real world of emergency response, these are dynamic, ever-changing scenarios. And if you spend too much time in contemplation, then the answer or solution you believe you've come to has changed because it took you 5 minutes to get there. And now the situation is different. Another 7 resources have arrived, or the incident has progressed or debilitated to a point where it now presents a different set of circumstances.
Yeah. So one of my challenges is to sort of make them to understand that you need to come to a decision at some point, usually fairly quick. It's not going to be the perfect decision or decisions because it's usually several, but you have to start somewhere. Yeah. And then you have to work from that point and make that decision or that situation better as you go along, because it's a dynamic event.
I always try and say, like, don't let good be the enemy of perfect. And what I mean by that is sometimes they'll be looking for the perfect solution when actually sounds like we're not trying to put people at risk, but good is probably as good as it's going to get.
Yeah.
And then actually,
make it good enough.
We all start moving towards good, it will become great. But don't go, no, this isn't perfect. I haven't got all my. You're never going to get all them ducks in a row. It's like herding cats at an incident, isn't it? It's terrible. It's just,
and you can't do that.
To create structuring out of chaos.
Yeah. But I also, coming back to tactics again, I try to make them to understand that when they realize that pretty much any operation is very similar to a game of chess, where you have your pieces and you sort of move them around, I think it's easier for them to understand that, okay, I have these and so I can't really recall what the pieces are called in English, but you have these different pieces and you try to move them around, and you have these rules for every piece on the chessboard, and you can just move them in certain ways. And it's pretty much the same thing with the resources you have on the fireground. I mean, if you have a group of firefighters with breathing apparatus, you can use them in some specific way. If you have another group without the breathing apparatus, you can't use them in the same way. But you still have to play the game in a sense. You have to use them because that's what you have.
And you also need to keep that communication frequent and clear, to have that shared situational awareness of risk. Because often I always say, if you stay in your head, you're dead. And what I mean by that is you can't just have the plan inside your head. No. It needs to be verbalized to everybody.
Yes.
Because I often say as well, a lot of the time, great incidents are 70%, if not 80% confidence, and 30-40% like full control and competency around the incident. And people may disagree, and they're just numbers for an example. And what I mean by that is, even if your plan it echoes back to what I've just said, if your plan isn't perfect, you still need to be very confident with it. Because if you've got the perfect plan, but you're timid about it, it's a little bit like when you see somebody turn up to basic first aid. If they get up there and they fumble around for a second and they don't seem to have control of the situation, they could have a doctorate in cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but the people around them are looking at them like, you're going to kill this person. Whereas if you turn up and all you've got is a first aid at work ticket, but you are confident, you're down there, you're doing the assessments, you're doing the primary survey, you start doing your compressions, people are put at ease. They're like, this person's here to help. They've got control of this. They are going to fix the problem.
You mentioned risks, and that's a sort of an interesting thing I was thinking about here, that when you get these calls, these hazmat calls, where you have a hazardous substance being released, most people would go like, whoa, I'm not going there.
Yeah.
This is dangerous. But and then you start to actually, in many cases, you actually analyze the situation and you figure out, okay, we need this protection, we need to do this, and we need to do that, and this order and everything. But when there's a house fire, we don't think about that.
No.
We just go there and we just dive in. And I was thinking, so what's the difference between a hazmat situation and a house fire? Let me just describe the scenario I have when you get to the scene. You have this building. Inside that building, there's an object releasing toxic substances that's filling up the building. And it's also hot. So you have heat. It's like, well, that sounds like a hazmat situation. Maybe we should slow down a little bit. Well, it's not. It's a house fire. But we just dive in. You have this black box. It's full of smoke, and it's burning somewhere in that building. You don't know where it is. You don't know what's burning. You don't know if there is any other people inside. You don't know anything. Just know it's a building, and it's full of smoke, and it's hot smoke. But we just dive into it.
Yeah.
But if you have this building that is filled with a toxic substance, you have this release of whatever chemicals inside. We don't go there. We stay on the outside, and then we analyze the situation, and we figure out what protection do we need, and then we start to work our way out into the building and figure out what's going on. But when we get the fire calls, we don't do a similar we don't analyze the situation in a similar way.
Is there an aspect there that risk has a strong association with frequency as well? Like if you're a builder and you work on a roof on a regular basis, your familiarity with that risk and tolerance and confidence with it, as in being at height, will become, and it can become dangerously familiar to the point where you forget to clip on and fall off the roof. But your competence in dealing with that situation is strongly associated with how frequently you interact with it. And I wonder if we put hazmats on this pedestal because they are so infrequent and they're almost dealt with like they're black magic. Do you know what I mean? Like there is some sort of...
if you, let's say it's like a general case, you have this building again. All you know about the building is there is some kind of a chemical inside being released. Well, you have these hazmat suits and you still have the breathing apparatus. Put the suits on and go in and check out what's going on. What's the problem? Because once you go in there and you can actually read, if you find the, what do you call that?
You can find the UN number.
The container or whatever.
The identification for it.
Yeah. You can read on the sign what type of chemical it is. And then you can start work from there. If there's a house on fire and you go inside, you can't read anywhere. If it's a couch or a mattress or a television or it's a full room burning, there's no sign saying this is the stuff you have in this room. And when it burns, you get these toxic substances. But when you have a hazmat incident, you can read the sign telling you what kind of chemical it is. And then you can start to work on that.
Yeah, which I suppose in ways should dramatically reduce your level of fear, because once you've got the identification of what it is, there's a set.
It's not a problem anymore.
It's not a problem because you just load it up on the system and it will tell you what firefighting media to use, what the control measures are.
Yeah.
And ultimately, like you said about sticking on the suits, you've got a limited number of resources you can use anyway. So until you actually go and find out what it is, it's not really going to change your strategy for dealing with it. You still need to go and find out.
Which means that house fires are actually more dangerous than hazmat incidents.
Yeah.
But we don't look at it that way. We look at it the other way.
And also, we know they're more dangerous because of the inherent risks, but also the data tells us they're more dangerous because the amount of firefighters that die at hazmat incidents, and I'm going to pull figures out of my arse here, but it is certainly dramatically less than history would reflect. Number of firefighters die at house fires. I wonder why that is. We need to have a hazmat expert on at some point. Just to try and help dispel. We have a great one in the UK. The gentleman's name, we call him Professor Green. I can't remember what his real name is, but he's a fascinating guy, and he dispels so many rumors and myths and fears around even things like the big scary stuff like radiation. He's like, well, okay, what if you ate it? Okay, what about if you come near it? So when you're outside, you give an example like when you're outside and you're getting burnt by the sun, because you didn't put any sun. When you go inside, you're not still covered in sun, and you're going to infect somebody with your sun. So it's like, and the way he breaks down alpha, gamma, and all the different radiation, and all that. And I think, oh yeah, but we do just have this like inherent fear or mythology about how to deal with these things. He says it far better than me. I'm sure I've ruined that, but
I think it has a very strong historic thing about it. I mean, it's called the fire service for a reason. Firefighters go to fires, they put fires out. We have fire trucks and fire stations and whatever stuff we have, fire hoses. It's sort of in almost in the DNA. We go to fires and we put fires out. So we don't really think about that it might be very dangerous.
Yeah.
It's sort of almost like not almost, it's an expectation. You're a firefighter, there's a house on fire. Why don't you go there? And we're like, no, we can't because it's dangerous.
Yeah, whereas when we think of hazmats, we have connotations, or it brings memories back of or Chernobyl, or a horrible disease, or a substance that, you know, causes an infection amongst all of civilization. And yeah, very often that's not the case. I worked at a station not too long ago where we had regional resources involved with detection, identification, and monitoring, and specific hazardous materials units. And 99 times out of 100, the substances we would go to, it was like, oh, it's just baking powder, or it's nothing, or it's, you know, and they were so resource heavy with stand and watch of 20 plus firefighters whilst two people waddle over, come back, test it, and go, it's absolutely nothing. And yeah, very, very resource heavy. And everyone else tends to get there as well, the police and the paramedics and everybody. And it's very expensive. And yeah, we just kind of build it up around this fear aspect, don't we?
I sometimes get that question. It's like, why don't you work toward with hazmat incidents? And I'm like, no, it's too easy.
Yeah, it is. There's not much
more interesting.
Yeah, we talk about source, pathway, and receptor, and that's about it. And then we talk about cordons, and that's it. It's like, stand back, wait to test it. When it tells you what to do, do the thing. There's less, unless it's got into a pathway or it's a gas that's spreading in a certain direction. Even then, there's very limited options. Whereas the tactics and multitude of different dynamics that you go into with firefighting operations is much, much more meat on the bone there, isn't there?
Yeah, fires are more challenging. It's dynamic in a very different sense.
Can I ask you about strategies and tactics and how you see them as being different, if you do at all?
There's a difference, but it's also the same thing. The difference comes in time, pretty much.
Okay.
To put it simple. So if you talk about strategy, it's as they usually say in the military, tactics is about winning the fight. Strategy is about winning the battle. Oh, sorry, the other way. Tactics is about win the battle, and strategy is about winning the war.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. So you can actually talk about you can use the same.
They're interchangeable.
The game of chess when talking about strategy as well. The thing is that when it comes to tactics, each piece on the chessboard is pretty much an individual firefighter or a group of firefighters.
Yeah.
But when you talk about strategy, it's a larger group, or it might be a fire station or a city, perhaps.
I remember, I forget what book it was I read it in, but I think of strategy and tactics like a highway. Like there'll be 5 lanes on the highway, and each individual lane is like a tactic.
Yeah.
But the overall highway, the strategy, is moving in the same direction. Now you can change lanes. Some of them are faster, some of them are slower. Some of them might wind off into this village and then rejoin the highway. But ultimately, they're all heading north.
Yeah, exactly.
But people can get really caught up in that, and they get bogged. They major in minor things, and they can get married to one tactic at the detriment of, like an incident analogy would be, you know, we're going offensive and we're doing internal this, but I'm like, what's the overarching goal of the incident? You're trying to bring it to a safe conclusion and limit the damage to the community and or environment. So you need to not get married to certain tactics and remember what the overarching strategy is, I suppose.
Tactics is part of the strategy. You can't sort of disconnect them. They are connected all the way.
I wanted to ask you, if I could, about the different, well, I mean, you actually founded, I only learned this from Shan recently because we spoke about the International Fire Instructors Workshop. You founded that, didn't you?
I did.
that's grown into quite a colossal beast over its lifetime. Talk to me about how that got started. What was the motivation for it? When did you put it together, and sort of what it's become today?
Well, that also comes back to my trip to New Zealand many years ago, 2007. And that was I went to New Zealand, I think it was like in mid-August, September, something. 2 weeks later, I came back home, and 2 weeks later, I was invited to a conference in Atlanta, which was this International Association of Fire Chiefs conference.
Mm-hmm.
And as a small part of that, Institution of Fire Engineers had a sort of a conference within the conference. And I was asked to come there and talk about how we worked with safety to firefighters. And no, sorry, it was the other way around. Exactly. I went to Atlanta first. Oh, that was the fun part as well. I went to Atlanta first, and then I came back home for 2 weeks, and then I went to New Zealand. That's the way it is. But in Atlanta, before going there, I asked the organizers about my presentation. I had asked, how frank do you want me to be? And he said, we want you to be dead frank.
Wow.
So I was.
How was that received?
I would call that interesting.
I love it.
Well, I had the presentation. When I started my presentation, I had like 30 people something in the room. And afterwards, I found out that the rumors went around the floor at the conference. So when I ended my presentation, I had like 80, 100 people in the room.
Whoa. That must have been overwhelming.
And there was one guy who was a journalist in the room who wrote for this newsletter, e-letter. I can't recall the name of it right now, but I have it all somewhere. And so the week after, they sent out this e-newsletter to like 50,000 US firefighters, stating that these Swedish fire officers are saying that American firefighters are stupid.
Oh.
And just for the record, I didn't say that. What I did say was that something like, and I still have that manuscript somewhere. I said that sending someone into a certain death is a stupid thing to do.
Mm.
And hopefully most of us can agree on that.
Of course.
All, actually.
Well, they have very different tactics, don't they? We're getting back to our previous conversation. Yeah. And some people do see their and if they don't understand the different complexities around construction and other aspects, I'm not getting into it, but it can appear incredibly dangerous what they do sometimes, and we can't understand the logic behind it.
Yeah. So the fun part is that when I came to New Zealand, they all knew about that. So that was kind of funny. So that was a part of it, including meeting Jean Raphael and realizing that we like I said earlier, that we all firefighters and we do the same stuff everywhere, all over the world. Although we do it slightly different perhaps, but still.
Did that response not discourage you at all from continuing your work or continuing your passion of sharing that? Because some people, and I have this with the podcast, some people have written incredible reports, they've done incredible research, but they fear the repercussions of sharing it or speaking about it passionately because, just chemically, we are group animals. Like I've said before, we don't want to lose face or be pushed away from the society or brotherhood, familyhood, whatever we're trying to belong to. So you didn't feel discouraged from that environment?
No. Well, for a minute perhaps, but I guess it encouraged me to continue to sort of push things forward. And when I came back from New Zealand, I realized that, there's so many great people out there all over the world, so that we need to sort of to put them together somehow and speak together internationally, just sort of share thoughts and share ideas,
seek
and share
to understand.
Knowledge. Yes, and share the knowledge everywhere. So I asked my employer back then, can I invite a bunch of people to our training academy and just sort of for a week we pay for their for living there and eating there, and we have these workshops and discuss things, and we do some training scenarios and whatever stuff for a couple of days. I was like, yeah, sure, go ahead.
That's a big ask, though. You're saying that like it was a small thing. If I asked that of my service, can we invite people from different continents or countries to come and share their? They'd be like, no. Well, I don't know what they'd say because I haven't asked, but
you should try.
I will try. Well, one of the things I'd like to do is, have you heard of the Fleur Lombard bursary or whatever it's called? Basically, it's there was a firefighter I spoke with a while ago who utilized this. Fleur Lombard was a firefighter that died, the first female firefighter that died in wartime history in the UK.
Yeah.
And to try and stop things like that happening in the future, they put together this bursary whereby you could access funding to go and travel to other countries and bring back learnings. So very similar sort of concept, and many organizations do very similar things. But it's still a big ask. And ultimately, you got the green light for it. You must have been in a well-respected position to be asking questions like that. That's not a cheap thing to ask.
No. I haven't thought about that way.
Well, shy kids don't get sweets. So you asked the question and they said yes.
We had more money at the agency back then. It would be much harder these days.
Yes.
But still manageable. So I had this bunch of people coming over. It's like Ed Harton, Paul Grimwood, John McDonough, Shan Raphael, and I do apologize. I can't remember all the names.
That's okay.
At this point,
we've got them on the list. They're all on my hit list.
Yeah,
I'm on the podcast.
Peter McBride from Canada, and a bunch of great people, and I just gathered them in a room for a couple of days. So we had the morning sessions we had in this room, and we just started talking. And the afternoon we went out to our training grounds and just made some training scenarios and burned stuff.
What was the fundamental things? What was the like discussion areas or thing when you sent these invites out? What was the pitch? What were you intending to discuss? Because ultimately
just to share knowledge.
Okay, around a specific topic, around fire behavior, around command, or around what in particular?
Firefighting.
Okay,
all kinds of aspects. So it was like an open. It wasn't just a empty piece of paper.
Yeah.
Let's start from here.
Okay.
And that was sort of interesting as well, because when people came over and on Sunday night, we gathered at the colleague's house, and it's like they all started talking.
Yeah.
As if they have known each other for like 1,000 years. Again, we do the same shit stuff all over the place.
Yeah.
We just talk different languages, and we have different color on our helmets, and we have slightly different technology, but still on many occasions we have exactly the same technology.
Were there any big things that really surprised you or really piqued your curiosity when a certain individual perhaps proposed a thought process or an approach where you went, really? And that sort of head tilt moment where you're like, tell me more about that. Was there anything that really surprised you in that first interaction or first workshop?
I was surprised how easy it was.
Really?
I was very nervous.
Really?
I mean, it could have been a flop, really.
Yeah.
I mean, we could have been sitting there for a week just saying nothing, talking about nothing. Getting mad at each other, starting throwing things and whatever. But just the first couple of minutes, I think we all realized we are all friends here. And it was a very open, there were no taboos whatsoever. Really? We questioned everything.
Do you think is it still like that now? Because you have to be like an eternal student to keep that curiosity. And when I spoke to Shan, like he's 61, 62 now, and he still seems like that playful child with that eternal curiosity. But some people, I don't know if that's as prevalent now. I don't know if it's as common for people to have that open-mindedness. Maybe I'm being a bit pessimistic here. How have you found? Has it changed at all over the years with the IFIW?
No.
Okay.
Not in that group. Not really. I think
maybe the negative pessimists just don't tend to go to those sorts of things.
I think that the people who comes to those occasions, those workshops, those are people who are looking for like-minded
Yeah.
people that are willing to share their knowledge and are willing to sort of talk about anything related to the fire service. What I might be slightly concerned is that it's well, at least for this country, it's very hard, or maybe I haven't looked hard enough to find people with that
level of passion.
Yeah, exactly. The spark.
I know it sounds hard and harsh to say that, because there are a lot of passionate people, but
yes, there are. Yes, it's hard to find them, but I can't really see. I know a few guys, but in this country, but
I think there's been a generational shift in that level of confidence as well, in people's ability to speak confidently about the things that they're passionate about. And I wonder if the younger generation, I don't know if technology's played a role in that, how much we are willing to lean into or engage with these sorts of public demonstrations of our own knowledge and passion. I think some people, and we tend not to have them on the podcast because they just don't attract that sort of audience, but it does seem like it's less cool to be so passionate about the job sometimes now.
I think very early in my career, I sort of ruled out looking for the career in sort of the traditional way.
Okay.
I mean, the traditional way in the fire service is that you sort of start as a fireman, and you work way up, and then you become the fire chief at some point. I was like fairly early, like, I'm not interested in having that kind of career. I'm not interested in being the big boss. I'm interested in looking at knowledge and trying to make things better. So I don't have any. Well, I don't really. Well, I do, but I was about to say I don't really care what's happening to me personally, in a sense, from a career point of view. I'm interested in finding the knowledge and sharing that knowledge with other people.
You're speaking to the choir with that sort of thing. Honestly,
I mean, it's a career. It's a career in itself, but it also means that I don't really have to. If I step on someone's toes, I don't really care. Well, I can apologize, of course, but if someone is insulted for whatever reason, I can probably explain why I insulted them, and it wasn't on my intention, but we still need to sort of open our minds a little bit to sort of look outside and not being insulted just by being questioned.
Yeah,
you need to question things, and you need to question other people and ask questions like, why are you doing what you're doing? And
you need to be open to that question as well.
Exactly. When I ask those questions, a lot of people get pretty much insulted, but it's not my intention. I ask the questions because I really want to know, why do you do what you do?
And it tests the validity of their belief as well in it, as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I always say have strong views weakly held, because if you can't demonstrate, like if I said to you, what data or what viewpoint would cause you to change your idea or your perspective, and if you can't demonstrate what would cause you to change your view on something, then you don't actually have a logical view. You have an ideological religious belief. If no piece of information would discourage you from believing what you believe, then you don't have a logical, rational idea. You have a whimsical belief that it's not founded on anything, and you can't articulate to me why. And like you say, that's what then tends to provoke that defensiveness in the questioning of it.
I mean, if you have this group of people discussing things, and everyone goes like, oh yes, that's great, that sounds good, that's a great idea, you need someone in that room going like, hang on a minute,
yeah.
Is this really good? Is this true? Could we do it in another way?
You need a red team.
But every time I do that, and I do that almost every day, there's always someone in that room who gets insulted. So what happened if we could put that aside, and when that person in the room says, hang on a minute, everyone would go like, well, we should think about this for 2 more minutes. before we make the decision or before we go down that road. You always need to question things.
How do you communicate that when you are teaching command and control? Because there's a place for conversation and deliberation and discussion, but that has to be calibrated when you enter into an incident ground.
When you're on the fire ground, you still need to ask the questions, but you need to sort out, when do I ask those questions openly and when do I keep the questions in here to myself for a few minutes. You need that thought process all the time. Sort of when you make a decision and you send the crews to do something, for obvious reasons, you need to make a decision and make things happen. At the same time, you need to keep the question open. Sort of, is this the right thing to do right now? Should we do something else? So, there are questions you need to sort of speak out openly, but there are also questions you need to keep up here in your mind for yourself.
Yeah.
But always ask the questions. So I tried to sort of make the students understand that, which is not very easy when you're like 24 years old.
Yes.
With no experience.
Yeah, you can't be the child going, why? But why? But why? Yeah, it can't be an eternal democracy. Some of those questions live inside a debrief or a learning conversation later on.
We spend a lot of time, if we have a training scenario running for, like, let's say an hour, when we try to spend at least the same amount of time having discussion afterwards. So if I have a training scenario 1 hour, then we have a discussion for 1 hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours. And then the next week I have a class. Then we bring up the questions again.
Takes a level of maturity though, doesn't it? That can be difficult, especially in an environment now where people have short attention spans, or shorter than they used to be. Those conversations I personally have found can be quite difficult.
I introduced a new rule in my class last week. It's like, no computers in my class. And they're like, what? No, you need paper and pencil and you write it.
Yeah, I couldn't do that because I tried to introduce that, and some people said they have certain learning styles that require them to use a laptop. But I find it disconnects you from the rest of the room, and I've not managed to get a solution to that yet.
I get all kinds of, well, not yet, because that was their second day on the class, so they still think I'm sort of deciding. I'm the boss.
Okay.
It's going to change, trust me. So they still think that what I say is the law.
Non-negotiable. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But
I already noticed that they hooked up on that and they realized that this is pretty good. And I tested that on my colleagues before I introduced the rule, and they were like, well, what if they say, I don't have time to write everything you say. And I'm like, well, you're not supposed to write everything I'm saying. You're supposed to listening to what I'm saying. I can't write down everything you have on your PowerPoint. It's like, you're not supposed to write down everything I have on my PowerPoint, because I'm going to give you my PowerPoint afterwards.
I'm going to give you the notes afterwards, yeah.
So you make notes, just a sentence and a word, whatever, and then you compare your notes with my PowerPoint. It's a learning opportunity to compare that. And when you have a paper and a pencil, you can make drawings, and you can draw an arrow from that sentence to another sentence somewhere else on the paper. You can't do that on computer. Well, you can, but it's like
so disruptive, isn't it? I find it takes people out of the room. And also, like, for me, I have elements of ADHD and things like that. And if someone's tapping away on something in the room, I can't engage. It just, I struggle with that when someone's doing that in the room.
Well, I had that question as well from my colleagues. Well, what if they have, what's that called in English? Dyslexia?
Yeah, they can't read it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, then I send them to our librarian, because she's got computers without any internet connection. So you actually can just write on the computer. The problem is that what I've seen over the years is that if they have the computers in the classroom, they start, when I get slightly boring, it happens, trust me, they start to look on everything else on the internet. Or if
answering emails, doing whatever.
Exactly. Or if I have, if I talk about risk management on the fire scene, they start to Google risk management on the fire scene.
Yeah.
And then I lose them for 2 minutes. And then we're disconnected from the classroom.
Yes.
And it takes them, even if it takes them like 30 seconds to do that on a computer, it's going to be at least 30 seconds because before they are back in.
It's longer than that. People say like, exactly, I can multitask. You can't. Yeah. We become more efficient at task switching. But I've read the data and like
in the classroom.
It takes you like 3 minutes to task switch effectively. So if I now picked up my phone whilst we're having this conversation and did something briefly, it would take my mind, apparently, 3 minutes to reorientate back to where we are in this conversation. People can't multitask. They think they can. They can't.
No one can.
No.
I want them to be present in the classroom.
Yeah.
To be active in the classroom, to share their thoughts with me and to their classmates, and to have the discussion in the room, because that's the learning opportunity. Google things, they can do that at the night or the weekends. Look at my PowerPoint, they can do that at nights or weekends. Be in the classroom.
To take me back for a second to the fire instructors workshops, this has been going now for how many years? 2000? When did it start? 2000?
Since 2008.
2008. So how has it grown? Because it's got its own arms and legs now, and it it operates every single year. Obviously, it had a flat patch during COVID. Everybody did, but what has it become now? It's running. It's in Spain this year, isn't it?
It is.
Portugal, sorry, yeah, because I'm hopefully going to be attending and annoying you with a bunch more questions.
But great.
What has it grown into now, and what does it look like? What can people who have never been? I know we've spoken briefly around it now. Is it still themed around the same thought processes, or is there things that people could find out about it?
I think it's still I made some rules for it several years ago, just some basic rules. You need to have at least, I think it's like at least 3 countries present. You need at least 1 scientist in the room. We don't have any budget for anything. It's on a be there and sort of be interested and be active. It's a thought process. It's about sharing knowledge. That's a basic thing about this. And even if we have these organizations inviting us, they don't get any benefits in any way. It's on a sort of and we make that very clear. We try to, at least. It works pretty good. So even if we have this company manufacturing turnout gears or whatever, they don't get any benefits. I mean, they can probably sort of show their clothing, but that's it. They don't get any extra seats or whatever at the table. They are supposed to join the discussion at the same basic rules as the rest of us. We are there for sharing knowledge.
So you have to participate. You have to show up and engage like a student with an opinion. It's not just a sit seminar style approach to life.
No.
How is it set out? Because it's run over a few days, isn't it?
Well, on many occasions it's been like a sort of a 2 or 3 days workshop with sort of active, and for economic reasons, there has been on many occasions like a 2-day conference open for anyone. You have to pay the conference fee probably, but apart from that, sort of it seems to work out pretty good.
It's wonderful though, and we're going to put the link to it in the podcast notes so people can go and find out. I'd strongly encourage people to go, only from what I've heard about it, and it's what's incentivized me to hopefully attend this year and become part of that discussion. And ultimately, like you were saying, just try and share some of that in a different way, in a different guise to a wider set of people, because it astonishes me when I speak to some people in the UK Fire and Rescue Service about some of our guests, and they go, "Oh, I'd never heard of that person before they were on." I'm like, "You're joking. They've been writing books and articles for the last 20 years. But I think so many of us don't tend to engage with those materials in the same way anymore. That's why I think things like podcasting is important. I actually have one question left for you anyway, but before I pose that last question to you, it's just around the book. Is there anything that we haven't spoken about that you'd love me to ask you about or get in before we look to wrap it up?
Well, I can mention one, maybe a sort of an obvious thing here is that it would be about fire ventilation.
Absolutely.
And that was actually part of my PhD work many years ago, that I started looking into fire ventilation. And that was sort of again, from a tactical point of view. So I used fire ventilation experiments and theories to sort of look into tactics a little bit. So I wrote this book on fire ventilation that was released in year 2000. It was also translated into English in, I think it was a couple of years later. A couple of years ago, I was asked if I could do a revision of that book.
A revision of it, yeah. Because ventilation and just constructions and the way in which we use it and the different phases that we have in the UK, as an example, has changed tremendously. Also, the technology has developed.
So I did that, and it turned out that the revised version actually became almost exactly twice as thick. It was twice as many words in it, twice as many pages in it. It was like, well, that's great, because it means that we've learned something. And I've met so many people over those 20 years working with fire ventilation, talking to me about fire ventilation. I've talked a lot to Chris Garcia. I've talked to a professor in Austin, Texas, and I talked to a bunch of people, Steve Kerber, not at least, and many other people. And it's like, we've learned so much over those 20 years. So that was sort of when I realized that the revised version was going to be twice as thick, I was like, well, that's great.
What are some of the biggest changes that you think you've seen across the way that it's used and the different tactics?
I think, generally speaking, we have become much better in the fire service, generally speaking, to sort of, coming back to where I started talking about that master apprentice thing, we have become better at actually looking at fire service stuff from a more analytical point of view. And there's a lot more people these days understanding that there's so much more in an operation, a fire rescue operation, than just listening to this master and doing what the masters did, and we do the same. I think people are starting to understand, and I think we've understood that for several years by now, we need to look into this more into detail. There's so many things in the fire service and putting fires out that we still don't understand. We do operation, it works pretty good, but I still think that there's a lot more to look into and learn and to be able to do operations much, much better.
I think
I'm not saying we do it badly, but I still think we can do it much better.
Absolutely. I think that learning process is better with incidents like road traffic collisions, because ultimately, if you don't find a solution at some point, then nothing's going to get any better. Whereas with a fire, eventually, they all go out anyway. You can do most of it wrong, and still there's no fire that ever started that's probably still burning now, because ultimately you could have got it wrong and it still went out, which I suppose discourages that learning iteration a little bit, because ultimately we eventually got there. But yeah, you have to be very curious to continue to lean into how can we do it better. Yeah.
And there's so many things around us in society that is changing. Everything from construction types. We have high rises, we have buildings below ground.
Yes.
We have infrastructure, we have trains and cars and airplanes and ships and electrical cars and lithium batteries and whatever. And we're still trying to figure out how to work operations in those scenarios. We're always one step behind, in a sense.
I think we're several steps behind with something like lithium batteries. We're having an expert on the podcast soon about that, because we are so behind the curve on adapting
we're
our
always
dynamics.
Behind. We're always behind. It's like we have wooden buildings. It's these days you're allowed to have high rises in wood construction in this country. And I'm like, well, there's a reason why we did ban that for many years. but suddenly we start to allow it again.
But ultimately, there's an
But
argument there
there are
for when people say about Americans and their tactics. The reason we can get away with some of that with modern construction is because of the chemicals and how the materials are treated, and the fire suppression systems and tactical ventilation systems that they try and put in place in these. And they don't always get it right, but
that's the key. You just said it. They don't
Hmm.
always get it right.
No.
So what happens when they don't get it right? Well, the fire service comes around, which means that whenever people have a problem, which they haven't engineered away, the fire service comes around to solve that problem, which also means that the fire service, we need to be on our toes all the time to figure out what is it that the engineers haven't engineered away.
Yeah.
Because then we have to engineer it into the fire service.
Grenfell, in a way, without trying to put it in a box, is an example of that, because there was many suggestions and amendments that needed to be made to that building, but ultimately we didn't have a perfect answer to how to deal with that.
No.
And the structural adaptations and safety considerations had also not been put in place, which left us in a very rock and a hard place kind of analogy. So for people that are unfamiliar with the content stuff, we obviously had that book some time ago, and then you've done a reiteration, but you're currently writing a book on firefighting tactics, are you not?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. When do you anticipate that being released, and what could people expect from it?
The answer on both questions will be I have no idea. Well, I'm in a discussion with the publisher.
Wow, so you're at that point already. So you've done a lot of the work.
Yeah. Hopefully this spring. It's going to be in Swedish. I'm discussing with them to translate it into English as well. Hopefully. Otherwise, there's Google Translate. Works pretty good sometimes.
It must be a colossal piece of work to put these together.
I mean, it's I've been working on that manuscript for like 25 years.
Bloody hell, man.
Although it's been resting for many years. So I took it up again just a couple of years ago, and I realized that I need to do something about this before I retire. I still have like 10 years before I retire, but 10 years is a very short period of time.
Blink and you miss it. Yeah.
But what can people expect from it? I think that on many occasions when someone writes a book on tactics, and I do apologize again, but I think that the expectations and the author usually writes those books in a sense that this is how we do it.
Mm-hmm.
This is how you should do it. What I'm writing is more like, this is how you can think.
Yes.
These are the things maybe you should think about these things, and maybe you should think about it in this way instead. I'm writing about the chess game.
Yeah.
Make comparisons with. I haven't used the orchestra yet, but since you're giving me that idea, I might do that as well.
Fold it in there somewhere.
The sports thing, I'm looking into the military side of it. I mean, they're talking about tactics as well, and it's fairly similar. So I would say it's a fairly different approach than what we're used to when we're talking about tactics.
It's not prescriptive. I mean, in the UK, we've moved in the last few years to a framework of national operational guidance, which is much less prescriptive. It's more of a, as you articulate it there, it's a thought process.
Yeah.
Have these considerations and have the awareness of these chess pieces of what things you could put in place.
Yeah.
And how that would contribute to your overall plan. But this is just guidance. Do you know what I mean? If you get too prescriptive on things, people push themselves into boxes that very much limit their ability to lead an incident most effectively.
What I'm hoping is that if someone reads that book, is that they start to think differently. Not necessarily act differently, but just sort of starting a thought process a little bit.
That's the best way
of looking at fire operations differently. Yeah. Without telling how you should do things.
Well, that'll ultimately make it eternal content as well. That would hopefully allow it to be something that people could reflect on in 15, 20 years and still be applicable.
Maybe. Hopefully.
Fingers crossed. Thank you so much for your time this evening. We've gone in so many lovely different directions there. I am going to put in the notes for this around. So there'll be a link to the IFIW, and I will dig out a link to, we'll put in the link for the document that we've been referring to as well, and also to your previous book around ventilation. Where's the best place to send people? Is the IFIW the best place to send them to find out a little bit more about yourself?
Well, yes, or they could just send me an email.
Are you happy for your email address to be available publicly? Think about that. Tell me later.
They can probably find it anyhow, but
okay.
Just a precaution. Busy days, I might not answer anything very fast, but usually I try to answer any email I get.
Sometimes it'll be weeks and weeks before I get back to replying to people. It's not out of disrespect or anything like that. No. It's just life is so goddamn busy, and the inbox fills up very quickly.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your time, boss.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'll wrap it up there, but I will hopefully see you in Spain and Portugal later on in the year. But I'll know that I'll be in touch long before then, and we can maybe do this again sometime.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Stefan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very, very much.
Take care, my friend.
You too.
Firefighters podcast is put together to develop, inspire, and hopefully even motivate those individuals who have chosen to serve our communities and be part of the first responder family. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield. If you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to see the podcast continuing, please head over to our Patreon page where you can support the ongoing efforts of the podcast. Please hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on whatever platform you're listening to. Please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.